Well, hello, and welcome to Rule of Carnage, where myself, Glenn Ford, and this guy, Mike Hutchinson, talk about designing better miniatures games. This week on Rule of Carnage, we're settling down into some leather-bound armchairs and all getting a bit historical about things. So for various reasons, partly I think for personal enjoyment, Mike has been getting very archival about his interest in miniatures wargaming recently, and I've read a few of like the odd Donald Featherstone and things like that, but Mike's been doing a bit of a deep delve. So we thought we would talk a little bit about some of the things that are part of the history of wargaming. I'm sure that everybody's got their particular like beats that they feel should be hit in any of these histories. I don't think this is going to be complete and comprehensive. We're going to talk a bit about some of the big parts of the history of wargaming, and then possibly later on we're going to talk about maybe some of the things that came from those moments and whether they're good things and whether can we readjust and what we can think about them, where they came from. So for the longest time, my sort of understanding of the history of wargaming has been something along the lines of Kriegspiel, H.G. Wells, Games Workshop, modern gaming. And that's vague. That's a vague idea that I have where these things roll along. You've really been looking into this, Mike. How big are the gaps within that history, and what is worth saying about those?
Yeah, so oddly enough, the documented gaps, there's not that many, but we can talk a lot about the 19th century. So one of the things that I've been really enjoying, I bought this incredibly thick book called The Zones of Control, which is a set of articles. In particular, it opens with an article by John Peterson, who you can look for John Peterson's books. I've managed to get a copy of Game Wizards, which is about the battle for D&D. There's a particular John Peterson book that I'm absolutely desperate to get a hold of, but you can't get it for less than 300 quid on Amazon at the moment, even though it's only from a decade or two ago. But anyway, he's an interesting sort of journalist and writer about it. And what I liked about this, and I thought I would just share some of it, is going back into the history of what maybe toy soldiers games look like. You do start with the Kriegspiel, the kind of the early war games. But basically the first time that war games sort of depart from chess is with this chap Johann Christian Ludwig Hellwig, who wrote, and I'm not going to read out the German title, but he wrote something entitled Attempt to Build Upon Chess, a Tactical Game which two or more persons might play, and that's from 1780.
I love German titles for books. They're so specific.
Attempt to Build Upon Chess, a Tactical Game which two or more persons might play. And so he does use the word Kriegspiel, war game, in this particular book. Which is the first time that gets mentioned. But what he does is he sort of blows chess up larger, and he takes the squares, and then he thinks, well, what we should do is fill the squares with terrain so that it looks cool. And there's like this beginning of, I'm not sure if he actually filled it with anything, but he sort of annotated in each of the squares what particular terrain might be in each. So you can kind of imagine a hexes war game. This is basically how Battletech still works, where you just write down the elevation or the sort of terrain that's in each place. And then he decided that he would reclassify the pieces into more modern branches of military, so infantry and cavalry and artillery, gave everybody way more chess pieces. I can only assume that he literally assembled many chess pieces and then handed them out, so everyone had like 100 chess pieces. But that apparently got fairly popular and was well played, and it was picked up by the Rieswitz family, who there's two generations of the Rieswitz evolution of wargaming. They're some kind of like nobles, and have the ear of the Prussian royal family, and it's the sort of household where the Prussian princes will stop round for a game, and so they take the billiards table or whatever, and what they do in eventually is they discard the gridded map and replace it with a big sand table, which is the sort of thing that you sort of hear about from the olden days. And we'll get to the 1960s later, where sand tables were the thing that people salivated over. But so they discarded the gridded map and replaced it with a sand table. So this is like 1809. We first see the removal of discrete movement, and like the sort of miniatures and measures are already there in 1809, where kind of scale movement and non-discrete stuff. And then he also removed, this guy Rieswitz also removed the chess pieces and replaced them with blocks of wood that were supposed to be roughly in scale with at least each other, so that a unit of infantry and an artillery thing were like roughly in scale with each other. So like, again, 1809, you've got non-discrete movement and you've got base sizes matter suddenly, right, which is quite cool to think about. And then they measured ranges and firing, and basically it wasn't like a board game anymore. It was basically already a kind of war game. And then with the recommendation and attention of the king, they formalized it into a system where, in order to be able to distribute it to other people, now that it was getting popular, now that it had the royal eyes, they thought the sand table was too faffy. So they got a big wooden chest and they filled it with terrain pieces that could then be transported around. So like, again, like, what's this, 1812? Like, you get your first kind of boxed war game. But obviously it's for Prussian princes at this point.
Yeah.
So it's like glorious, brass objects in an enormous case. Yeah. But yeah, so that's like first boxed terrain kit.
Oh, right. I mean, that's interesting, because I had always thought that war games started with the desire to, simulate war for training purposes, rather than that it came from the abstracted world of chess.
Right. And that does emerge over the next sort of 50 years as the Prussians kind of comes into their thinking, and they start to use it as a tool. But no, initially it was purely a leisure activity. There's a funny bit here where it's like the king, this is the king of Prussia, moved the Rieswitz apparatus, because they always describe this stuff as the apparatus, to Sanssouci Palace, where it was played at night in colder times of year, with games often lasting long after the royal family would ordinarily retire.
Yeah, that sounds like most war games.
Yeah, it sounds like most war games. Obviously turn length was already a problem in 1812.
Okay, so you've got the Prussian royal family shifting around brass bound chests of gaming apparatus. What's the next sort of?
So there's still more innovations in this Rieswitz apparatus. So the one of the youngest sons, I think it might be the youngest son, in about sort of 12 or 15 years afterwards, augments his father's work by adding dice and probability and statistics. And so I don't know how it was played up until this point, but like, it's the son that decides that, we ought to have some randomness in it. So the first chap, Helwig, had written in his first book in whatever it was, 1780, he'd written nothing would be left to chance, like a sort of God doesn't play dice kind of a statement. But this sort of third generation wargamer decides, based on his experience on artillery ranges and from shooting guns, that chance was all over the place in the role of war, and that they needed to roll dice in order to admit chance to it, but that he's insistent that this is not the admittance of chance, this is the admittance of realism, because you can't really know what's going on. So here, with this third generation of wargamers, you get chance, but you also get the beginnings of an obsession with, well, what would be a realistic simulation based on the experience that I have with these machines of war.
And again, that's interesting, because it's like, I mean, obviously at this point you're not going to get somebody you could easily term as a game designer making game design choices, but it's interesting that introducing chance has been done as part of the argument for simulation, even at that early stage, rather than as the argument for, because it makes it more fun, it makes it more interesting. Because it's hard to imagine what a chess like because presumably it was originally like chess, and this thing beats that thing, and that thing beats that.
Right. Yeah. Presumably there
And
was nothing was left to chance.
and it will always play. Yeah, and it will always play out that way. And it's hard to imagine how you could repeatedly set up the troops with the same set of troops and the same set of probabilities and not very quickly play out to a this is what is always successful. So it's interesting again that chance has been brought in to make the game more realistic rather than to make it more fun or more interesting.
Right, and then continuing his campaign to bring realism into the Kriegspiel, this younger Rietzwitz decides to introduce a neutral referee with broad powers because that eliminates the omniscience of players, which he perceives to be, very unrealistic. That you can see the whole thing and you can make decisions based on it. So for me, this is super interesting because it's 1824 with basically the third war game ever as far as this research is saying, and we've introduced a neutral referee, which to a degree sort of in vestiges continues all the way through to second edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle in the late 80s, and obviously we'll get into the 60s. The 40s and 50s have a lot of refereed war games in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, but this feels now like quite an archaic thing, but you and I both know from our own experiences that it's in our lifetime that we kind of removed the faff of the neutral referee, even though it's still a thing that role-playing games are struggling with.
Yeah, and I find it an interesting thing that someone decided that you needed to introduce the idea of a referee like third edition in. It's one of those things I feel like it would either have been there from the start, or it would have been ages down the line where someone's like I say, I always thought of it as a thing that comes with the Kriegspiel thing of, well, we need to be training junior officers, and so we need a senior officer who will make sure it's realistic and difficult and useful as a training exercise, because otherwise they could just find a loophole in the game. For it to be no, 3 editions in, I've realized that what you need is, and you wonder where it's okay, well, this is a game being played by noblemen, so who is the referee? Is it another nobleman who wants to join in, or do you have a referee serf who has served in various battles and trots along and yes and sir, it shouldn't be like that, sort of thing going on.
Yeah, exactly. And then in continuing his tinkering, this younger Rietzwitz is a real tinkerer. He also decides that because he's trying to make it more realistic and more simulationist, and because he's trying to eliminate the omniscience of players, and now that he's introduced a referee, he also decides that players should probably track their own forces separately and then mark their suspected things in a sort of battleships kind of a way. And so he begins to shift his games from the 3-dimensional gaming table to maps. And he recommends conducting his game on the topographical Lehmann maps used by the Prussian General Staff at the time, rather than the 3-dimensional terrain favored by his father. So they're again, he's sort of trying to lean further and further. And what it ends up feeling like to a modern reader is well, he's going more towards kind of cards and counters war games.
Yeah.
As we would understand them. And then it's sort of there's an evolutionary tree broken at this point in 1824, where sort of 3D terrain and miniatures and measures head off in one direction, and squares and counters and lack of omniscience and hidden information and stuff sort of go in another direction. It's super interesting.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely it feels like this guy is sort of abstracting out. It's interesting that it went from chess, which is incredibly abstract, and then we've created this thing with sand tables and furrows and trees and miniatures and whatnot, and then somebody is taking on, and I'd be very curious, we try to read around game design and things. I'd be curious to see if there's somebody who could so clearly be pinned down as being a games designer doing some games design stuff, prior to this, because this is clearly, he's a games designer. He's very much taken this thing and he's sort of started looking at it, you know, in game design terms. And the idea of going from the physical tabletop with the trees and the hills and things over to a more abstracted map, because you want to include hidden information within your game, is such a game designer's choice. It's so the sort of thing that we've been through at various points of, he's looked at his game that he wants to make and he's gone, now is this a minis game or is it a board game? Which is a question I ask myself on an extremely regular basis. It's such a games design moment that he's having there. That's you know, absolutely fascinating.
And so wait, there's more from the younger Reeswitz. So here, John Peterson writes, for some German soldiers, Kriegspiel became more than obligatory training. It was a passion. These fans idolized the younger Reeswitz. Some called him the military Faust. And before the end of the 1820s, we learn of the existence of a Prussian club dedicated to war games, the Berliner Kriegspielverein. One early admirer ran a club in Magdeburg that was later a celebrated field marshal, and contributed to the development of the model of the Prussian model of war. So yeah, so again here in our third edition of the Kriegspiel, we find the beginnings of wargame clubs.
Yeah, and this is where it's sort of specifically feeding backwards and forwards into actual training of officers then, I guess, because
that's right. So at some point in this early development, so the Reeswitz game was only briefly adopted by the Prussian military in the 1920s, and then it enjoyed a resurgence in sort of 1860s. And was used to educate officers in making command decisions. And then by 1870, Oxford in England had a Kriegspiel club, and so it sort of begun to spread to our land. And then you sort of mentioned Wells, but 5 years before H.G. Wells, you get Robert Louis Stevenson writing or being written about in 1880. And I tried reading the article, but it's so old-timey that it's really, really difficult to kind of ingest. But lead soldiers had become a sort of mass market commodity, mostly German manufacturers. And so like kids in England in the 1880s were likely to have, if they were a well-to-do family, they were likely to have a box of lead soldiers around the house. And Stevenson had some game, the rules of which are not captured in this article and may forever have been lost, unless what's his name from the war game historical project that's published all those books has found them somewhere. And there in Stevenson's game, each lead figure represents 100 soldiers, so you get that sort of funny little scale locking thing that you sometimes find in historical games throughout the sort of the 20th century. But like H.G. Wells, the combat resolution system is a skill-based one with a pop gun cannon type situation. So there's no probability or dice rolling or tables or anything. It's all shooting.
Dexterity-based resolution.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I mean, is H.G. Wells the next sort of little moment in the
well, so just before H.G. Wells publishes Little Wars in 1913, I thought it was super interesting to learn that there's a set of soldiers or models that are manufactured under the brand Britons, and in 1908 they produce a pamphlet called The Great War Game for Young and Old, which is basically rules how to stage a competitive game with the Britons figures. And this writer says the rules had many gaps and omissions. But I think that that's super interesting to find that in 1908, a manufacturer of miniatures has decided that having a pamphlet of rules is probably a good way to continue to advertise and stimulate toy soldier sales.
That's a mass production, non-miniatures agnostic war game being produced in 1908, which
that's right,
is equally extremely interesting. And like you say, before H.G. Wells and his Little Wars, which I think is a very interesting moment, because that's a moment where it's like, okay, people have decided that it is a viable business decision to create a war game in order to sell, little toy soldiers to people, which is something that we're all obviously very familiar with. I think so. The one thing I always think about H.G. Wells, which I think, and I might be wrong, I've always felt is a possible sort of divergence point, is that there's Little Wars, but there's also Floor Games, which is a separate book, and that Floor Games seems to be this very sandboxy, exploring-based miniatures game, and obviously Little Wars is a war game. And I always wondered what sort of games we'd be playing now if Floor Games had been the one that had taken off, if there'd been something a little bit less
right, a bit more playful,
focused on competition.
I mean, the fun and interesting thing I think about H.G. Wells is that it's very gamic, it's very playful, it's very childlike, in an A.A. Milne sort of way, not in a putting down sort of a way.
Yeah.
But also he's very anti-war, even in the Little Wars book. And so he's not interested, like Kriegspiel was, in teaching the mechanics of war so that you can understand it better. He's sort of there to give you a toy to play with and sort of discourage war on a philosophical basis.
Yeah, obviously that's always been he wrote sort of extensively, and obviously he lived to see the First World War, didn't he, H.G. Wells? So his opinions, I think, only hardened on that side over time. So with the advent of the World Wars, how does that affect the idea of playing a game called Kriegspiel?
Yeah, so it's super interesting because there's basically nothing that I have discovered between H.G. Wells in 1913 and Fletcher Pratt, who's a science fiction novelist who becomes renowned for running giant naval war games in dance halls in New York.
Yeah.
Like he fills these dance halls with people, and they each get to command one ship. And it's a sort of social event, and there's well-dressed men and women sipping cocktails, and they've got their one ship, and then they all laugh like drains when it gets blown up and go and have another drink and a smoke or whatever. Yeah. And so for a hot second in the tail end of the Second World War in the US, wargaming is actually a legitimately acceptable social thing for couples.
Yeah. Yes. I've remembered,
and it's literally never happened again.
Yeah, I've read about these things. This is a proper thing that you played in a ballroom, and there were spectators, and everyone went along, and they had their little ship, and they'd sort of play their ship, and this guy the referee would stride about the ballroom, making judgments about hits and misses, and yeah, and again, that's super interesting that it was this incredibly short-lived thing where it's an evening out to go to a big event war game.
Right, and one of the things that I was reading sort of just assumed that, or was making the assumption that during the war there was a sort of romance and an excitement around simulating war and sort of feeling connected to the activities that were going on. But once the Second World War had ended, just no one wanted to know about that. That was the last thing that people wanted to do as part of their leisure activity, and so as a general social activity it was completely rejected. Yeah. And so it then sort of retreated back into, but so Fletcher Pratt produced a slim volume describing his naval war game in 1943. So from 1913 to 1943, you've got this 30-year gap where literally no wargaming literature is produced.
So that's getting into the sort of the Donald Featherstone sort of compilations of wargaming. So we've gone from the 1780s
1780s, that's right.
1780s through to the 1940s, which I think is a solid chunk of history for anyone to handle for a single YouTube video or podcast. If you have come across war games within some of these blind spot period that Mike hasn't come across, I think would be super interested to hear about them. And this is one of the things where if you are going to drop in the comment section, you're going to need to give references. And
we don't care the style, but we need to know the source.
We're going to want some actual book names and sources for things, because this is something that I think is genuinely fascinating.
Yeah, and if you want to have a read through some of what I've talked about, and goodness me, a lot more, check out this Zones of Control compilation. It's quite an academic book, mostly about war games in the military sense, but there's quite a lot of stuff for the hobby gamer as well.
We will carry on this conversation, this history, hopefully bringing it up to the modern day in our next conversation. Drop into the comment section about your favorite historic war game during the period of the 1780s to the 1940s, because you need to hold off on your comments about the ones for the 60s until the next video, so you don't keep your powder dry on that one. Drop into the Discord. We have a lovely Discord channel with lots and lots of lovely people who are extremely interested in chatting about these sorts of things. Genuinely lots of people talking about their favorite sort of slightly arcane and archaic war games in the Discord. So you'll find friends there if you are interested in these older authors and their older games. But for now, it's going to have to be a thank you and a goodbye from us from this episode of Rule of Carnage. So I would say thank you and goodbye. Bye.
See you in a bit. Bye.